Next question. What should be the role of the federal government in coastal Louisiana? Dr. Magar.
Yes, sir. First of all, we have to acknowledge that the federal government created this problem in coastal Louisiana whenever it levied the Mississippi River in the name of commerce. One of the issues when I started in this race, there were two issues I needed to learn more about. One of them was immigration, so I went to the border. And the second one was on coastal restoration. And so I went to see Mr. Wendell Curall down in South Lafourche Parish, South Lafourche Levee District. This is a very complicated issue. We know the science behind this. We understand what needs to be done. The question, though, is my father-in-law is a shrimper on the Wrigley's. And there's a lot of things. One of the main things we got to do is we got to increase the freshwater flow. If we increase the freshwater flow, it's going to increase the silt deposits and it's going to start rebuilding that coastline. These are things that need to be done right here in Louisiana. We have projects that we need to do right here in Louisiana. The problem is the federal government has confiscated money from us in the form of taxes and stripped the states from the ability to serve themselves. If we get the federal government out of our business, the state of Louisiana will have plenty of money to restore our own coastline. It's our responsibility.
Thank you. Mr. Landry.
The first problem is the core. That's our problem. And the second part is the funding mechanism. Because we send $7.5 billion of oil and gas royalties to the federal government every year. $7.5 billion. Think about that. And yet the federal, to the U.S. Treasury, and yet we're finally going to get, in the next few years, a small portion of that royalty money. And what does the federal government do? Our president institutes a deep water moratorium. It only exasperates the problem. Now, instead of getting the money that we rightfully deserve at a time when we rightfully need it, he's killing the industry. And that's where the revenue to fix our coast comes from. It comes from the oil and gas that's sent to the other 50 states and to the American citizens to produce energy, to turn their lights on, to help design their clothes, their cars, and all of the other things that we rely on every day that petroleum products are based on. I'm out of time.
Thank you. And rebut.
I would just reiterate the fact that the federal government is going to give us 35% of those oil revenues, what Jeff is referring to, but not until 2017. And so one of the first things that we need to do in Congress in the next year is to push that agenda forward to make sure we get those oil royalties now and not later.
Good. Thank you. And our last detailed question, this will be for Mr. Landry first. The Commerce Clause in the Constitution has been a vehicle for our federal government to impose a whole lot of laws on the states that are probably totally unnecessary. Tell us, do you believe that it has been interpreted too liberally, and how do you feel about that clause?
There's no doubt that the federal government has abused the Commerce Clause to the Constitution. Not only has the federal government abused it, but our judiciary has abused it as well. It is the Commerce Clause that the federal government has used as an excuse to trample all over the 10th Amendment. When we send people to Congress who understand and respect the 10th Amendment and who are not afraid to shed some of the powers of the federal government over to the states, then the federal government won't be able to use the Commerce Clause as the whipping boy to increase its size and to continue to strip rights away from American citizens.
Thank you. Candidate Magar?
Yeah, if we go back, I think the case was Wickard versus Filburn, and the case was regarding wheat production. And a farmer wanted to produce some wheat on his land. The federal government said, no, you can't produce those acres of wheat, because by consuming that wheat yourself, you're not buying wheat on the open market, and therefore, interstate commerce and the Commerce Clause applies. That's foolishness. And of course, this federal government has been overreaching ever since that time to the present day. And we've got to turn this thing around. We've got to take control as not only, we need leadership right here in the state from our governor. It's one thing to go down to the coastline and put your hand in the oil, say here's a bunch of oil. It's another thing to take a stand and say we're going to build these berms anyway. And so I think what we've got to do is we've got to find people who are real leaders to stand up to this federal government, and that's what I intend to do.
And rebut.
Well, I would just use the example that Congress and the administration have just shoved healthcare down our throat using the Commerce Clause. So just, if you don't understand the far-reaching effects that the federal government uses that clause to intrude into our liberties, that is just one example.
Okay. Thank you very much.